Imagine intercepting a perfectly formatted corporate spreadsheet from a foreign government.
Right, like something totally mundane.
Exactly. The columns track budget allocations, daily caloric intake, logistical supply lines, and weekly headcounts.
Sounds incredibly boring.
It really does. It looks like the quarterly report for, I don't know, a massive agriculture conglomerate or maybe a sprawling logistics firm.
Yeah.
Until you look closer at the column headers and you realize it's the operational logistics for 2.3 million political prisoners,
Wow.
hidden right within the borders of a modern industrialized superpower.
Yeah, it's chilling.
So the question for you, our listener, is how does a society hide an atrocity of that scale behind, like, administrative paperwork?
And more importantly, once you see that spreadsheet, what exactly are you obligated to do about it?
Right, because that spreadsheet is the breaking point, isn't it?
It really is. It strips away all plausible deniability. I mean, you can argue with political rhetoric, you can dismiss rumors, but you cannot argue with the mundane bureaucratic math of a supply chain designed for human containment.
That terrifying collision of bureaucracy and brutality is the engine driving our deep dive today. Welcome to another deep dive where we're unpacking a fascinating and, frankly, profoundly unsettling pairing of texts.
Yeah, we've got a really unique combination today.
We do. We're looking at a philosophical essay disguised as a blog post by a 10,000-year-old Martian observer named Zyloth.
A great framing device.
Totally. And we are pairing that with the novel this Martian practically demands his readers consume. It's a dense, hyper-detailed, near-future geopolitical and military thriller called Nordlicht ARC.
Written by the author Kelvin Moralist.
Right. Now, because this source material deals intimately with the collapse of American democracy into a brutal, technologically advanced authoritarian regime, it inherently trips a lot of modern political wires.
It does. It touches on a lot of sensitive stuff, so we really need to establish the baseline right now.
Absolutely. Our job today is not to validate or condemn the specific political ideologies the author is exploring.
Right, whether you map them onto the left, the right, or the center.
Exactly. We are entirely impartial here. We are strictly stripping this narrative down to the studs to examine the anatomy of institutional failure, the mechanics of resistance, and the logistical nightmare of trying to salvage a society that has actively chosen to dismantle itself.
Because the author is essentially using this fictional regime as a stress test for human morality and institutional resilience.
Yeah.
And we are just here to look at the results of that test.
So we are moving from the absolute highest altitude, like the 10,000-year statistical view of civilizational collapse,
Yeah.
all the way down to the granular blood and mud reality of an 800,000 troop liberation effort.
It's in a massive scope.
It is. So let's start in orbit. Let's talk about Zyloth.
Right, so the Zyloth Diaries serves as the philosophical preamble to the novel. The persona of Zyloth is brilliant because the author explicitly strips away any, mystical or science fiction tropes.
He's not a wizard.
Exactly. Zyloth isn't a prophet. He doesn't have a crystal ball. He is literally just an exhausted, ancient Martian analyst sitting in an observatory on Olympus Mons.
Just crunching the numbers.
Exactly. He's applying basic pattern recognition to a 10,000-year data set of human behavior.
He specifically rejects the title of God or seer. He says, I am doing statistics on a very large sample size.
Yes. Zyloth is essentially applying a Bayesian framework to human history.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So his baseline expectation based on millennia of data is that democracies decay.
They're not the default.
Right. They are not the default state of human organization. They are anomalies. And the specific pattern he is currently tracking is what he terms democratic backsliding.
Which is such a sterile term for something so destructive.
It is. But he notes that societies almost never collapse overnight in some, spectacular cinematic coup.
Right. No fireworks.
Exactly. They fail through a sequence of individually defensible, incremental administrative steps.
A norm is broken here.
An oversight committee is defunded there.
A judicial appointment is politicized.
Exactly, and each step is justified as a temporary emergency measure or, a necessary correction.
But Zyloth points out the real pathogen isn't the political maneuvering itself, right? The pathogen is exceptionalism.
Yes. The citizens living through the decay always believe their specific institutions are immune to the laws of historical gravity.
They look at Rome or Weimar and think, well, we have checks and balances. We have a constitution. That math doesn't apply to us.
And that exceptionalism is the cognitive blind spot that allows the decay to metastasize. Zyloth uses a remarkably humbling metaphor here.
Oh, the cockroach one.
Yes. He rejects the notion that humans are apex predators. Apex predators, he notes, don't routinely engineer their own mass extinctions.
Not personal.
Instead, he classifies humanity as tool-using cockroaches.
Which, I mean, sounds completely derogatory, but he's actually highlighting our primary evolutionary advantage, isn't he?
He is highlighting our adaptability, yeah. But he pairs it with our fatal flaw.
Right.
A cockroach is highly resilient, but it is reliably, predictably drawn to the bait trap that kills it.
So we just keep walking into the trap.
According to Zyloth's data set, humanity is constitutionally incapable of learning from the previous cockroach's experience. We run the exact same failed historical experiments regarding, like, the concentration of power, expecting different outcomes purely because our technology is upgraded.
Okay, but I have to stop you there because I am inherently skeptical of this kind of deterministic framing.
Okay, how so?
Is civilizational collapse really as predictable as a physics equation? Or is a 10,000-year-old observer just suffering from massive pareidolia?
Finding patterns where there are none.
Right. If you spend 10 millennia staring at the rise and fall of empires, you start seeing the patterns of collapse in every chaotic school board meeting or, messy election.
Yeah, I see your point.
How much of this is rigorous pattern recognition, and how much is just the ultimate case of confirmation bias?
Well, Zyloth actually anticipates that exact critique. He clarifies that he isn't claiming a 100% deterministic certainty.
Okay.
He's plotting a trajectory. He basically says, look, I've seen this specific configuration of institutional erosion, polarized rhetoric, and wealth stratification hundreds of times.
And the outcomes cluster.
Exactly, the outcomes cluster. He is trying to identify what he calls the inflection point.
Right, the window of intervention.
Yes. An inflection point is a very narrow, fiercely contested window in a society's timeline where the trajectory can still be altered by internal democratic mechanics.
Before it goes over the edge.
Right, because once that window closes, the trajectory becomes a cliff.
Yeah.
The momentum of the authoritarian machinery takes over and internal correction becomes impossible.
Wow.
Zyloth is breaking his usual detached, sardonic observer persona because his data indicates humanity is sitting dead center in that inflection point right now.
He compares it to having the winning lottery numbers before the draw. But the prize isn't cash.
Right.
The prize is that your children don't have to grow up in a heavily armed, paranoid dystopia. But handing people the winning numbers doesn't work if they refuse to buy a ticket.
It's infuriating for him.
Which forces Zyloth to pivot his methodology. If his 10,000-year statistical white paper isn't waking the cockroaches up, what does he suggest?
He pivots to fiction.
Yeah.
He points his readers directly toward Nordlicht ARC. Zyloth recognizes a fundamental flaw in human cognitive architecture.
Which is?
We process statistical risk intellectually, but our behavior is driven almost entirely by emotional threat detection.
Ah, right.
You can hand a citizen a peer-reviewed, statistically flawless analysis of how their democracy is degrading, and their brain just files it under abstract, low-priority data.
It's a climate change problem. You read a report about a 2.5-degree global temperature increase and oceanic acidification, and you cognitively understand it's bad. But your heart rate doesn't change.
Yeah.
You go back to drinking your coffee.
Right.
But you watch a visceral, terrifying movie about a family drowning in a flash flood in a city you recognize, and suddenly the threat bypasses your intellectual filter and hits your amygdala.
The cognitive bypass. Zyloth calls the novel a tool, contrasting it with a prediction.
Okay, what's the difference?
Prediction is passive. You receive it, you debate its accuracy, and you wait to see if it happens. A tool is functional.
Right.
Nordlicht ARC is engineered to be a mirror, reflecting the world after the inflection point has been missed. It's set roughly 20 years in the future, starting in the late 2040s.
When the United States is plunged into a highly efficient authoritarian nightmare.
Exactly.
The title itself carries the weight of this mechanism. Nordlicht is German for the Northern Lights. But the author defines the aurora borealis not as something inherently peaceful or magical. He defines it as illumination produced by a violent collision.
Charged solar particles slamming into atmospheric resistance at hundreds of miles a second.
Exactly. The title dictates that in a fallen world, moral clarity and freedom are not passively inherited. They are only generated through immense cost, violent friction, and devastating collision.
But the critical distinction Zyloth makes is that Nordlicht ARC is not just disaster tourism.
Right.
There is a whole genre of dystopian fiction. He points to things like The Handmaid's Tale or 1984 that masterfully illustrates the mechanics of the fall and the horror of the regime.
The classic warnings.
But this novel focuses almost entirely on the agonizing logistical and moral reality of the response.
Yeah, that's what makes it so different.
It forces the reader into the terrifying machinery of what it actually takes to drag a civilization back from the abyss once the institutions have vanished.
Which means we need to open this toolkit and look at the inciting incident. Because the way the author shatters the status quo is a masterclass in contrasting mundane bureaucracy with apocalyptic stakes.
It really is.
We are dropped into Ottawa, November 2043.
The setting is deliberately sedate. It's a windowless conference room in the Chateau Laurier.
Super boring.
Extremely. 14 mid-level diplomats from Europe and Canada are arguing over Atlantic fishing quotas and tariff schedules. It is the slow, grinding, unglamorous machinery of international trade.
The coffee is cold, the delegates are checking their watches, and then the door opens without a knock and Heinrich Brandt walks in.
Right.
He's a senior liaison from the German BND attached to the Solaris network.
Which is the European intelligence framework that has effectively replaced the fractured Five Eyes Alliance.
Yeah, he's with a data scientist, Dr. Erickson. Brand casually interrupts a debate on cod yields to announce that the fishing quotas no longer matter.
They secure the room, and Dr. Erickson brings up a presentation that fundamentally detonates the geopolitical reality of everyone at that table.
She drops a bomb.
She explains that a specialized European AI running something called Turing mirror protocols managed to briefly penetrate the American Bureau of Loyalty Assessment legacy servers.
The hack only lasted 72 hours before the regime's firewalls severed the connection. But the data they extracted was statistically damning.
It wasn't smuggled, grainy photographs of black sites. It wasn't defectors telling harrowing stories.
It was the spreadsheet we talked about in the intro.
Yes. The AI bypassed the regime's propaganda layer by hacking their internal resource management software. It found construction contracts for high-tensile wire, budget allocations for industrial caloric paste, and weekly personnel rosters.
The banality of evil quantified.
Dr. Erickson projects the aggregated data. The AI uncovered 117 remote detention centers.
And the author specifically notes the geography, right?
Yeah, they aren't in New York or Los Angeles. They are hidden in the vast, empty tracts of Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and the Nevada desert.
The regime calls them the spaces between, which is a psychologically brilliant and just horrifying strategy.
It's terrifying.
You build the architecture of oppression so far removed from the population centers of your loyalist citizens that they literally never see it.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. The regime supporters can genuinely dismiss rumors of the camps as enemy propaganda because in their daily lives, the trains run on time, the grocery stores are full, and the suburbs are quiet. The atrocity is geographically siloed.
Dr. Erickson then aggregates the weekly headcount reports from all 117 facilities. The total number of detainees, precisely as of November 1st, 2043, is 2,312,847.
Over 2.3 million citizens, stripped of rights, vanished from the grid.
And the logistical strain is visible in the data. She highlights a facility in Montana engineered for 4,000 inmates that is currently holding over 6,000.
It is operating at 156% capacity.
Disease metrics are spiking. Caloric deficits are normalized. And amidst this avalanche of sterile, horrifying numbers, the AI managed to pull one piece of visual security footage.
An 8-year-old girl, her face pressed against the reinforced glass of a locked ward.
That single image collapses the emotional distance of the statistics. The Danish ambassador physically has to leave the room.
Laurent Deschamps, French ambassador, looks at the spreadsheet and realizes the era of strongly worded diplomatic protests is over.
Because that data creates an inescapable geopolitical trap. For years, the European coalition had relied on plausible deniability.
Right, they issued sanctions, they condemned the regime's rhetoric.
But they told themselves the internal matters of a sovereign superpower were not their jurisdiction. The Turing mirror AI stripped them of that deniability.
It's a profound commentary on our relationship with technology, actually.
Yeah.
The human institutions, the free press, international observers, human rights tribunals, were all successfully blinded or banned by the regime.
Yeah.
It required an artificial intelligence, an entity utterly devoid of political cowardice or cognitive dissonance, to simply aggregate the localized supply chain math and present the mirror.
The machine had to show humanity the depth of its own depravity.
But see, isn't that a terrifying modern anxiety?
Right.
That as societies become more closed, we increasingly have to rely on artificial intelligence to show us our own humanity, or lack thereof.
It is, but seeing the truth in an Ottawa conference room doesn't instantly translate to action. You cannot just declare war on a nuclear-armed, geographically massive superpower.
Right, the logistics are insane.
The data forces these diplomats into a room to make a choice that defies modern historical precedent.
Which brings us to April 2044. A covert bunker complex outside Brussels and the brutal calculus of intervention.
This is where things get real.
32 democratic nations are debating the invocation of Article D, a formalized legal obligation to commit military force to defend populations facing industrial-scale atrocity.
The debate is vicious. Chancellor Holst of Germany and President Renault of France are demanding immediate mobilization.
But you have fierce opposition, too.
Right, from leaders like Viktor Nemeth of Hungary, who argues that they are essentially voting to trigger World War III. He demands to know why European blood should be spilled and European cities risked to nuclear retaliation for a population that voted its own way into this nightmare.
Wow. But Holst's counterargument is the moral anchor of the coalition, isn't it?
It is. She invokes Germany's mid-20th century history.
She states, Germany learned exactly what happens to the soul of a continent when good people calculate the cost of intervention and decide to do nothing. We will not learn that lesson twice.
Powerful stuff.
The vote passes. But passing a vote is just rhetoric. Executing the logistics is madness.
It is. Supreme Commander General Philippe Demarque is handed an impossible brief.
What does he have to do?
He has to secretly mobilize and position an invasion force of 800,000 troops, 2,400 main battle tanks, and 1,850 combat aircraft.
That's massive.
And he has to do it without the American surveillance apparatus, which is monitoring global satellite feeds, financial markets, and shipping lanes, realizing what is happening.
How do you even hide an 800,000 troop buildup? If you spike defense spending by hundreds of billions of euros, the global financial markets flag it instantly.
Right.
If you move thousands of tanks to ports, satellites see it.
So Demarque hides it in the dullest, most impenetrable camouflage available to the modern administrative state,
Which is?
the Transatlantic Trade Realignment Initiative.
It's brilliant.
For 3 years, European, British, and Canadian diplomats hold highly publicized, mind-numbingly complex symposiums on agricultural tariffs, steel subsidies, and supply chain harmonization.
It's like hiding a diamond in a box of old tax returns because no one ever looks there.
Yeah.
And every single one of those working groups is a front.
Yeah.
When they debate agricultural shipping capacities,
Yeah.
they are actively calculating the fuel burn rates for an amphibious assault fleet.
When they subsidize heavy machinery manufacturing, they are quietly retrofitting civilian cargo ships to deploy armor.
They bury the logistical architecture of a continental invasion inside international tax code revisions.
The regime's intelligence agencies are entirely focused on hunting domestic dissidents and monitoring encrypted military channels. They just don't have the bandwidth to parse thousands of pages of Canadian dairy quota negotiations.
It is a logistical masterstroke. But the timeline required for that level of deception demands a staggering moral compromise.
It does. The mark requires 19 months to position the assets for T-Day.
And during those 19 months, the regime does not stop.
No, the detention network expands. The camp population swells from 2.3 million to over 3.1 million.
God.
Demarque's intelligence analysts estimate that 180,000 human beings die of malnutrition, execution, or disease, while the coalition carefully prepares its trade agreements.
Hold on, we have to look closely at Demarque's calculus here, because the author refuses to let him off the hook. There is a highly specific incident that distills this abstract death toll.
The Montana cell.
Right. A 12-person resistance cell operating in Montana is compromised by regime security forces. They are trapped, and they transmit an encrypted plea for extraction. Demarque has covert special operations assets pre-positioned near the Canadian border. He has the physical capability to extract them.
And he denies the request.
He orders the local commander to stand down.
He watches the live satellite feed as regime forces breach the compound and execute all 12 members of the cell. Demarque memorizes their names, but he lets them die.
I am genuinely appalled by this. I mean, you can call it strategic discipline, but he just effectively sanctioned the murder of loyal allies to protect a timeline.
It's a dark choice.
This is the ultimate horrifying trolley problem. Is the choice to sacrifice 180,000 people over 19 months to ensure the success of the invasion a sign of strategic brilliance or the loss of the very moral high ground they are fighting for?
That intense friction is the exact response the text demands from the reader. Zyloth told us fiction is a tool to make us feel the stakes.
And we feel it here.
War, the author suggests, destroys moral purity before the first shot is even fired. DeMarc knows he is committing a profound moral injury. He accepts the damnation of those 12 souls and the 180,000 who died in the camps because if he breaks camouflage and the regime realizes the coalition is mobilizing, the invasion fails. And if the invasion fails, 3.1 million people die.
It is the inescapable trolley problem, scaled up to the level of a continent.
Exactly. But even with perfect camouflage, DeMarc's entire invasion plan is predicated on a suicidal assumption.
The nukes.
The American regime possesses a fully functional arsenal of 6,000 nuclear warheads. The moment Axis Nordwind crosses the Canadian border, the regime should theoretically vaporize Paris, London, and Berlin.
Which brings us to the most delicate, terrifying mechanism in the narrative, the shadow network. The coalition is only invading because they have a guarantee from a ghost.
Precisely. The Founders Circle, a highly compartmentalized, clandestine resistance network composed entirely of high-ranking American military officers and political officials who survived the purges and spent the last 15 years quietly fighting the regime from the inside.
We get an incredible look at their operational reality in a scene set in a remote hunting cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. No electronics allowed, just a wood-burning stove and physical maps.
Very old school.
You have four-star General David Webb, commander of the regime's Eastern Defense Zone. You have Admiral Catherine Osei, formerly of the Pacific Fleet. They're meeting with a former CIA operative acting as the sole liaison to the European coalition.
And the liaison demands to know how the Circle plans to neutralize 6,000 nuclear weapons.
Because it seems impossible.
Admiral Osei's response is a masterclass in asymmetric bureaucratic warfare. She explains that they can't physically dismantle the warheads, and they can't hack the launch systems because they are air-gapped.
Right.
But the regime made a fundamental structural error. They kept humans in the loop.
Right. A missile is a machine, but the sequence requires human launch officers turning keys.
So the Circle spent a decade and a half selectively curating the personnel files of the Strategic Command.
Sneaky.
They manipulated promotion boards to ensure that the officers sitting in the silos, the ones holding the actual launch keys, were individuals who exhibited subtle psychological markers of deep, inflexible morality.
They didn't try to break the missiles. They actively selected for conscience. They are betting the survival of the European continent on the assumption that when the regime orders a retaliatory strike on a civilian population center like Brussels, a 28-year-old launch officer in a bunker in North Dakota will look at the authentication code and simply say no.
It is terrifyingly fragile. But it's not just the personnel. Admiral Osei details how they poured sand into the gearbox of the entire nuclear command structure.
What did they do?
They introduced obscure redundancy protocols. They championed software updates that intentionally introduced microscopic latency into the verification channels. They engineered the bureaucracy so that a 15-minute launch sequence would degrade into a 3-hour chaotic mess of conflicting authorizations, giving the coalition enough time to conventionally destroy the silos.
It's essentially the weaponization of bureaucratic friction. It's like a body's compromised immune system, unable to fight off the disease completely, but keeping the vital organs functioning just long enough for external antibiotics to arrive.
That's a great analogy.
And General Webb is doing the same thing on the tactical level. The liaison informs Webb that Axis Nordwind, the primary Canadian-German armored thrust, is going to cross the border at Buffalo. Webb looks at the map and realizes his own elite 10th Mountain Division is stationed directly in their path.
So Webb utilizes his legitimate authority as the Eastern Defense Commander. He doesn't order them to stand down or surrender, which would trigger immediate suspicion from the regime's political commissars.
Right, that would be too obvious.
He issues a completely standard, flawlessly documented order deploying the entire division to Colorado for high-altitude mountain warfare exercises.
He literally just moves the army out of the way. He signs a piece of paper, and an armored division packs up and leaves the invasion corridor wide open. The regime is utterly compromised from within. But this creates a massive paradox. The invasion only works because the authoritarian regime failed to completely purge the humanity and conscience from its own ranks. Can you ever truly enforce total loyalty?
Well, the author suggests that total loyalty is a statistical impossibility in a system that requires millions of moving parts.
Right.
Totalitarianism demands a perfect machine, but machines are built by emotional, deeply flawed human beings. The regime's surveillance apparatus was designed to monitor digital communications and financial transactions.
So the founder circle operated entirely in the analog spaces, the regime's algorithms deemed irrelevant.
Exactly. They passed messages through the Protestant Military Chaplains Network because the militantly secular regime leadership assumed religion was an antiquated non-threat.
The regime's ideological arrogance became its structural blind spot.
And with that blind spot ruthlessly exploited, the 19 months of preparation finally expire. The camouflage is dropped. The theoretical logistics become blood and steel.
It is today, June 6th, 2045.
A highly deliberate echo of the D-Day landings exactly a century prior.
So the narrative shifts from the high-level commanders down to the mud. We follow Axis Nordwind. They are executing a massive amphibious and airborne assault across the Niagara River, pushing from Ontario into Buffalo, New York. And our focal point is Unteroffizier Elias Richter.
Elias completely subverts the trope of the young, invincible super soldier.
Oh, totally.
He is a 45-year-old cybersecurity architect from Hamburg. He has a slight paunch, bad knees, a wife named Anna, and 2 daughters.
He's a reservist who felt the moral compulsion to volunteer when the data from the Turing mirror leak was made public.
The contrast the author builds between Elias's mundane civilian background and the terrifying high-tech reality of the 2045 battlefield is incredibly sharp.
Tell us about the suit.
Elias is encased in a Hussar 2040 tactical exoskeleton. It costs 850,000 euros. It augments his strength, monitors his biometrics, and links him directly into the AGS tactical network.
Let's break down how that AGS network actually functions, because it's not just a radio. It is a shared augmented reality mesh.
Yeah.
Elias's HUD overlays trajectory lines for incoming fire. He can see the heart rates and ammunition counts of every member of his squad projected in his peripheral vision. The quad functions as a single, terrifyingly lethal, hyper-connected organism.
And that squad is a microcosm of the global coalition.
Right, who's in it?
You have Heinz, a Bavarian who copes with the terror of the landing craft by compulsively checking his magazines and offering everyone illicit schnapps.
You have Dieter, who grew up working in his father's garage and fundamentally distrusts the AGS software, convinced that anything relying on a battery will fail when he needs it most.
You have Lindholm, a massive, quiet Swede. He specifically requested assignment to Axis Nordwind because he's trying to push through to Minnesota, where his cousins disappeared into the CAM system a decade ago.
You have Afolabi, a Nigerian-British combat medic quietly murmuring prayers over a silver crucifix. And you have Frank, a 23-year-old German carrying a physical piece of history into the fight.
Frank's inclusion is a devastating emotional anchor. He carries a small silver coin taped over his heart. But the object itself isn't what matters. It's the provenance.
Where did he get it?
Frank's great-grandmother was a prisoner in the Buchenwald concentration camp in 1945. She was liberated by an American infantryman who gave her a silver dollar and a piece of chocolate. She kept that coin her entire life.
Wow.
Frank is carrying it back. He represents the repayment of a generational moral debt.
The historical inversion is profound here. A middle-aged German IT guy and a kid carrying a Buchenwald artifact are crossing a river in mech suits to liberate American concentration camps.
It is a complete mirror image of the 20th century's foundational narrative.
But the most poignant member of Elias's squad isn't European at all. It's Lucas the Nguyen.
Right. Lucas was born in California. His parents were Vietnamese refugees who fled to America, only to find themselves trapped when the regime closed the borders.
Tragically ironic.
His father was executed during a political purge. Lucas managed to escape to Canada, but his younger sister, Emily, was arrested for attending an unsanctioned protest at her university.
So Lucas is wearing a German uniform, invading the country of his birth, driven entirely by the desperate hope of finding her.
And all of that emotional weight, all of that high-tech AGS preparation slams into the brutal reality of a prepared defense.
Yeah, the crossing is not a clean surgical operation. It is a slaughter.
The regime's forces are waiting. They have pre-registered mortar coordinates on the riverbanks. They deploy autonomous loitering drones. The coalition's electronic warfare planes are desperately trying to jam the signals, but the sheer volume of fire is overwhelming.
Elias's battalion suffers 17% casualties in the first 20 minutes.
It's a bloodbath.
The water turns into a chaotic churn of sinking exosuits and burning landing craft. Elias's suit takes a direct hit from shrapnel. His shoulder is shattered.
But the suit reacts, right?
Yeah, the suit's internal medical system instantly injects a localized anesthetic and expands a foam surgical sealant into the wound just to keep him from bleeding out in the water.
And then the regime deploys a localized EMP weapon.
Oh, man.
The electromagnetic pulse detonates over the river, and instantly the 850,000 euro technological marvels become coffins. The AGIS network drops, the augmented reality goes black, the servos and the exosuits lock up.
So suddenly, Elias is carrying 60 kilograms of dead weight. The high-tech network super soldiers are reduced to terrified men dragging themselves through the mud, fighting purely on adrenaline and base instinct.
But before the EMP hits, the text details a specific function of the AGI software that defines the moral chasm between the coalition and the regime.
The Turing Mirror Protocol.
Yes. The regime's loitering drones operate on what they call loyalty-first coding. It is a crude, brutal heuristic.
How does it work?
If the drone detects a heat signature that isn't broadcasting a regime cryptographic handshake, it fires. It doesn't differentiate between a Canadian soldier and a lost civilian child. It is algorithmic slaughter.
But the coalition's AGI system is entirely different. Elias aims his rifle at a shadowy figure in a shattered building. But his trigger won't pull. The gun is physically locked.
Because the AGI system is running continuous real-time targeting evaluation, it's using thermal gate analysis to determine if the target is carrying a weapon. It's attempting to cross-reference facial geometry against pre-war DMV databases.
In real time.
In real time. If the system calculates a probability higher than 40% that the target is a non-combatant, it engages an electromagnetic sear inside the rifle. It literally locks the firing pin.
So the soldier is forced to physically input an override sequence to fire. It forces a cognitive pause.
Right.
The commander of the unit, Fisher, tells Elias during training, the protocol makes us slower. It will probably get some of us killed, but it keeps us who we are. We are liberators, not an extermination force.
It is a fascinating proposition. We so often fear that AI will be used to automate the kill chain, completely removing human empathy from warfare.
The regime proves that fear is valid.
But the coalition uses AI to enforce an ethical boundary. They programmed a digital conscience to counteract human panic.
Does this Turing Mirror Protocol, which forces a human to confirm every shot, suggest that technology's highest purpose in the future of warfare is actually to force us to remain human?
I think that's exactly what the author is arguing. Without that software, a terrified, bleeding 45-year-old IT guy like Elias might just spray bullets into every Duke window out of pure survival instinct.
The protocol proves that morality in high-stress environments isn't just about having good intentions.
It's about engineering systems that physically refuse to let you abandon those intentions when the shooting starts.
But while Elias and his squad are fighting for every inch of the riverbank, relying on orbital satellites and multi-million-euro suits, we have to remember that American citizens had already been fighting an invisible war for almost a decade.
We have to talk about Merita's war.
We do.
Yeah.
Because while the European invasion is the spectacular crescendo, the internal resistance is the agonizing, sustained baseline. The narrative flashes back to 2036.
We are introduced to Captain Marita Lopez. She is an active duty Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton when the regime fully consolidates power.
Right.
Her unit receives Directive 47 LPHA. The orders are explicit. Deploy to downtown Los Angeles and utilize lethal force to clear civilian protesters violating the new indefinite curfews.
And Marita looks at the operational briefing, looks at her commanding officer, and simply refuses.
She knows it means immediate court-martial, likely execution for treason, but she states clearly that the order is a direct violation of her oath to the Constitution.
So she is arrested, stripped of her rank, and loaded onto a transport.
But the transport is ambushed by early defectors, and Marita escapes into the urban sprawl of Los Angeles. She begins to build an underground network that eventually becomes known as the Veterans for the Constitution.
What the author masterfully executes in these chapters is the complete demystification of the glamorous resistance movement.
Oh, absolutely.
There are no dramatic speeches in hidden bases. It is an excruciating, paranoid, exhausting existence. The regime has constructed a digital panopticon. They control the internet, they track financial transactions, they use facial recognition on every street corner.
It's total surveillance.
How do you fight a guerrilla war when buying a gallon of milk flags your biometrics in a central database?
You fight it by going completely analog. Marita's network survives by utilizing low-tech spycraft specifically engineered to operate beneath the notice of the regime's algorithms.
They don't use encrypted messaging apps.
No, the regime's quantum computers crack those in hours.
They use library books.
Yeah.
Marita signals a meeting with a cell leader by walking into a specific public library and leaving a copy of Moby Dick's Spine Out on the third shelf.
Genius.
They communicate logistical routes using invisible ink made from lemon juice, written on the back of discarded grocery receipts, which can only be read when held over a lighter.
They use chalk marks on fire hydrants to indicate compromised safe houses. They are fighting a 21st century hyperstate using 19th century tradecraft.
And the psychological toll is devastating. The author doesn't shy away from the staggering casualty rate of this analog war. We learned about Jonah.
Right, Jonah. He's a 22-year-old idealistic college student who volunteers for the network. He makes a single microscopic error during a raid to steal antibiotics from a clinic.
What does he do?
He drops a burner phone. The regime traces it, executes him, and sends his parents and his teenage sister to the camps.
And the guilt Marita carries for Jonah's death is suffocating. Then there's Doc Reyes, a former Army trauma surgeon who patches up wounded fighters in basements. He's eventually captured during a sweep.
The regime tortures him for a week. They bury him in a shallow, unmarked grave. But he dies without giving up a single coordinate for a safe house.
And Marita's most profound personal loss is her husband, Marcus. He was also a Marine, running a separate cell in Chicago. He is caught facilitating the escape of targeted political journalists.
He is executed in a prison courtyard. The regime doesn't even grant Marita the dignity of knowing where his body was disposed of.
A sympathizer manages to smuggle Marcus's dog tags out of the prison. Marita wears them taped to her chest under her clothes for 7 years. It is her only physical connection to the life she lost.
Her second-in-command, Harris, reflects the absolute exhaustion of this existence.
Yeah, Harris.
Harris was an Air Force intelligence officer. He lost his wife and son to a regime raid in 2038. He is described as a man who has forgotten how to sleep.
He just sits in corners, constantly scanning for exits, running tactical exfiltration scenarios in his head on a loop.
His only tether to humanity is a crumpled, faded photograph of his son at a Little League game that he looks at for exactly 30 seconds every morning.
The contrast is just incredibly stark.
Yeah.
Elias has an 850,000 euro exoskeleton, but Marita survived for 9 years using a specific book left spine out on a library shelf.
Right.
It seems the author is arguing that true resilience doesn't come from armor or software, but from the unhackable nature of human trust. Is low-tech actually the ultimate defense against high-tech authoritarianism?
It suggests a profound thematic argument. High-tech authoritarianism, with all its drones and algorithms, is ultimately brittle. It can be hacked, jammed, or blinded. But the low-tech resilience of human trust, a shared glance, a smuggled dog tag, a refusal to break under torture, operates on a frequency the machine cannot decode. Analog resilience is the ultimate defense against digital tyranny.
And ultimately, these two completely different paradigms of war, the hyper-advanced European invasion force and the scarred, exhausted American resistance, converge on a single, harrowing geographical objective in Buffalo.
The hospital.
Yes, the anatomy of liberation.
Axis Nordwind, having secured the beachhead, pushes inland. Elias's squad, alongside Canadian forces, is tasked with securing the Erie County Medical Center, ECMC.
But it's not a hospital anymore.
No, the coalition intelligence indicates that the regime requisitioned the sprawling medical complex years ago. It is no longer a place of healing. It is designated as a regional loyalty assessment center.
This chapter is the emotional crucible of the entire novel. The juxtaposition is physically nauseating. You have a structure architecturally designed to save human life, filled with MRI machines and surgical theaters, that has been systematically mutated into an industrial facility for torture, interrogation, and psychological destruction.
Elias's squad breaches the reinforced emergency room doors. The sensory details the author provides are suffocating.
Oh, I can imagine.
The air recycling system is failing. The squad is hit with the overwhelming smell of industrial bleach, failing to mask the scent of gangrene, unwashed bodies, and pervasive fear. As they clear the wards, floor by floor, the reality of the spreadsheet from Ottawa becomes flesh and blood.
And the prisoners' reactions to the breach are agonizing. They don't cheer. They don't understand they are being liberated.
They see 7.5-foot-tall, mud-covered, heavily armed mechanical giants smashing through the doors, and they shrink back into the corners of their cells, assuming this is just a new, more terrifying method of execution.
In the psychiatric isolation ward, Lindholm uses the hydraulic pincers on his damaged suit to snap the chains holding a man to a steel bed frame. The man is emaciated, his white beard matted with dried blood. He was a constitutional law professor at Yale, imprisoned for subversive historical instruction.
And when Elias removes his helmet and speaks to him in German, offering medical aid, the professor begins to laugh. It's a broken, hysterical laugh.
What does he say?
He looks at Elias and articulates the ultimate, bitter irony of the moment. My grandfather took a bullet on Omaha Beach fighting the Germans to save Europe, and now the Germans are kicking down the doors in Buffalo to save America from itself.
But the true descent into the heart of darkness happens on the third floor. Ward 3C. The sign bolted to the reinforced door reads, Juvenile Re-Education, ages 5-12.
Elias, who has 2 daughters back in Hamburg, physically hesitates. He almost cannot bring himself to open the door. Inside, they find the children of executed dissidents and resistance fighters.
The regime didn't kill them. They stole them to be psychologically dismantled and rebuilt as loyal state assets.
Elias approaches a 7-year-old boy cowering under a desk. The boy looks at the European flag patch on Elias's shoulder and asks, his voice trembling, "Are you gonna hurt me?" The instructor said the foreign invaders eat children.
The regime had actively weaponized the children's minds against their own rescue. Elias drops his rifle, kneels down in the glass and the blood, and spends 20 minutes softly telling the boy about his daughters, Anna and Clara, and the bakery they live above in Hamburg, just to coax him out from under the desk.
Yet amidst this suffocating darkness, the author provides one profound moment of convergence. Lucas Nguyen, moving frantically through the East Wing, finally finds what he crossed an ocean for.
He finds Emily.
She is in a severe malnutrition ward. She is skeletal, covered in deep contusions. The regime guards shaved her head entirely as a punishment for attempting to organize the other prisoners.
When Lucas violently clears the room and screams her name, her reaction is chilling.
She is in such a profound state of psychological shock. Her survival mechanisms are so deeply entrenched that she barely registers him. We get a brilliant, painful insight into her internal monologue.
To survive the daily interrogations and the sensory deprivation, she reduced her entire consciousness to pure, controllable math.
She counts everything.
14 steps from the door to the reinforced window. 7 other patients in the room. 3 meals a week. She built a fortress of numbers to protect her sanity.
But when the math breaks, when she finally looks at Lucas and recognizes her brother's eyes behind the visor of a foreign uniform, the fortress collapses. It is a devastating, explosive release of accumulated grief, terror, and desperate love.
But Emily is not just a passive victim to be rescued. She represents the unbroken core of the society. She tells Lucas how the guards subjected them to daily psychological warfare, piping in audio telling them the world had moved on, that no one was coming, that their families were dead.
But Emily fought back with the only weapon she had left: communication. She explains the shaved head.
Right.
She and the other women in the ward were caught passing microscopic notes written on torn bed sheets, coordinating morale, sharing the names of those who were taken away so they wouldn't be forgotten.
She touches your shaved scalp, looks at her heavily armed brother, and offers the ghost of a defiant smile. She says, "They took our hair to humiliate us, but it didn't work. We kept passing the notes. We just figured out how to fold them smaller."
She is the embodiment of what Marita was fighting for on the outside. The regime tried to hammer them into submission, but instead of breaking, individuals like Emily became tightly wound, coiled springs of defiance.
But that coiled spring analogy leads me to my deepest fear about this narrative, and it's where I have to challenge the triumphant note of the hospital rescue.
Okay, what's your concern?
You can cut the physical chains. Lindholm does it with hydraulic bolt cutters. The flags change. The regime falls. But once a human being has been a coiled spring for a decade, living in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, paranoia, and trauma, how do they ever safely uncoil?
It's a massive question.
Can a population that profoundly traumatized, a population where neighbors turned each other in for extra food rations, ever genuinely return to a normal, functional, trusting society?
You've identified the tragic, lingering reality of liberation. The physical war, as complex and bloody as it was just logistics and ballistics. The psychological war, dismantling the architecture of paranoia, deprogramming the children in Ward 3C, figuring out how Emily ever sleeps in a dark room again that will take generations.
The trauma of authoritarianism doesn't evaporate just because the dictator is dead.
No, it doesn't.
Which brings us to the end of an incredibly heavy, deeply necessary journey. Let's trace the massive arc we've covered today. We started in the high atmosphere with Zyloth, the 10,000-year Martian, utilizing Bayesian priors to warn us that democratic decay is the historical norm, not the exception.
We moved into the sterile bureaucracy of the Ottawa Intercept, where an AI forced diplomats to confront the banality of evil in a spreadsheet. We analyzed the agonizing moral calculus of General DeMarc trading 180,000 lives for operational surprise.
We looked at the shadow network pouring sand into the gears of a nuclear superpower, the brutal technological inversion of Elias's T-Day landing, the analog resilience of Merita's 9-year guerrilla war, and finally the agonizing reality of Emily's survival in the hospital ward.
It is a comprehensive anatomy of how a society dismantles itself and the staggering multi-generational cost required to put it back together.
And as we close, we want to reiterate, this deep dive explored a work of speculative fiction. The world of Nordlicht ARC is a meticulously constructed narrative designed to act as Zyloth's tool.
Our analysis does not endorse any specific real-world political faction.
Exactly. Our focus has been entirely on the structural and moral questions the author poses about the fragility of our institutions and the limits of human endurance.
But those questions are designed to be uncomfortable. They are designed to follow you after you close the book.
They absolutely are. And I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought drawn directly from Captain Marita Lopez in the epilogue.
Yeah.
She is standing in the ruins of Los Angeles, looking up at a newly raised flag. And she is struck by a terrifying realization. For 9 years, her singular consuming purpose was survival and destruction. Tearing down the regime gave her absolute moral clarity. That was the easy part. But looking at the rubble, she realizes that building something new, something that won't just fail again in 20 years, is infinitely harder.
Right.
So I ask you, sitting in your car or at your desk right now, what if the true inflection point of a civilization isn't the slow slide into darkness? And what if it isn't even the spectacular, heroic war required to end it? What if the real test of a species is the morning after liberation? How does a society that has fought itself for a decade learn to trust its neighbors again when the uniforms finally come off?
That is the ultimate diagnostic murky water.
Exactly. When the institutions are shattered and the X-ray is broken, how do we actually heal? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take that question with you. We'll see you next time.